to have your CEO, it's a rare thing to have your most senior executives be so invested, genuinely invested in this type of initiative, and it's rarer than you think.
Welcome everyone. I'm Richard Parfitt, the marketing manager at iVentive. I'm joined today by Berry Lumpkins, who is the Head of Organisational Development at NKT Group. Berry has something in the region of 2 decades of experience in the learning and leadership space, with roles in the Middle East, in North America, in Europe, at companies including Siemens, Zurich Insurance, DP World, First Abu Dhabi Bank, and several others that I'm sure I'm missing as well. Berry's a veteran of iVentive events as well. Will be with us in Copenhagen, I believe, later this year, and actually spoke at our Learning Futures Europe Virtual Knowledge Exchange just last month at time of recording on the topic of defining great leadership from the ground up, which is the topic that brings him to us today. So Berry, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Richard. Thank you so much. And as you say, I should take that even further. I'm a big fan and advocate of iVentive. I've been participating since kind of the beginning when the company started.
Yeah, well, your check's in the post. Thank you. But yeah, thanks again so much for joining us. So I mentioned that title of your breakout session at Learning Futures Europe in my intro about defining great leadership, and leadership is something we've seen so much on the pre-event surveys that we do as being one of the top topics that learning is really interested in. Even so far this year, leadership development has been a more popular topic on our pre-event surveys than artificial intelligence, for example, just to show you how much of a priority it is. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little about the kind of work you're doing around leadership at NKT Group and why you think it's so important, not just for yourself, but for the learning profession.
Yeah. Well, once again, thanks, Richard, for having me. I mean, if I think back, as you said, I'm coming up around 20 years of experience and in this field. And I remember really early in my career, when first coming in contact a lot with leadership development. And around 2006, there was a book that came out called The Speed of Trust, which is, of course, very well known now. But at the time, it caused a lot of ripples in the world of leadership development, because I remember someone saying that, more senior than me, saying, I'm not sure if we can introduce this because it's so much about trust and it's not about dollars and cents and telling people what to do and so on. And it's amazing how far we've come now. It's a very different conversation in 2024, and it just continues to be such a key focus area. But if I go back to my current context, I mean, actually that's the key word, context. I joined this organization, NKT, about almost exactly 18 months ago. And I was lucky enough to come right in at a time when I got to spend my first month, this was October 2022, working together with our CHRO to craft the HR strategy 2022 to 2026. And one of the key elements we realized that we needed to get really clear on with the growth trajectory of the company was, what does actually great leadership look like at NKT? It's something that wasn't really clearly articulated. And then we take that in combination with context. So one really interesting thing about this organization is people really in the culture expect and really want their voices to be heard. So if we look at the values framework that we currently have in NKT, that's been around almost 4 years, it was actually crowdsourced in late 2020 through a process of focus groups, kind of from the ground up. All of that input was gathered, fed up to the executive team, and those were then sort of articulated, what we now call our shared beliefs. And I mention this because almost 4 years on, I can say with conviction, this is only the second organization I think I've ever worked for where our values framework, our shared beliefs in this case, actually mean something. It's not just a poster on the wall. And so, of course, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, as the American saying goes. So when we got to this topic of leadership, looking back, it made complete sense to follow a similar path how we defined our culture. And that was kind of the starting point in the beginning of 23 for this journey around defining leadership.
And how important is it that you do it, as you were saying, from the ground up, rather than having the CEO scribble something on a piece of paper? And
I'll go back again, context.
yeah.
I can also think about other companies and company cultures where I've worked, where actually I'm not sure that this approach would work. I think that just because of the nature of the importance or lack thereof of hierarchy, or perhaps maybe the CEO had kind of a different history or position in the company, in those other contexts, it could be that the CEO or the executive team, it would actually be accepted very well if they were the ones that articulated the expectations of leaders, and then it was rolled down or rolled out, so to speak. But in our case, I can't see that happening. People, again, they really want to have their voices heard. And by the way, our most senior executives, this is exactly where they wanted to start. They wanted to know what our people were thinking about this key topic. And so that's kind of what led to this journey of over roughly about 8 months end to end that really started with a lot of focus group work.
And so what was it those voices were saying? You say you wanted their voices to be heard. So what are the pillars that you came up with?
Yeah, so we designed a 90-minute kind of focus group concept. It's almost like a structured brainstorming process where we went across, and I led most of those in person. We had a couple virtual, but most were in person. And this started sometime around last summer in 2023, where we took the group and really dove in on 3 key questions. And quite simple questions, but maybe sometimes we need to take a step back and really reflect on simple questions. The first one being this: think about the best leader you ever had in the past. So look back. What did that leader do differently from others, and how did they make you feel? Now, I'll tell you that it may or may not surprise you or those listening, but 80 to 90% of our colleagues across these focus groups answered the same way. Oh, and by the way, I individually interviewed all of our executives and asked them the same question on the spot, and they mostly answered in the same way. And long story short, they answered, this person trusted and empowered me, and they genuinely listened to me.
And does that translate back into the kind of learning culture that you can create when you have that trust as well, when people have the safety to identify the areas they need to improve, where they can find the right resources? Is that a really important part of that?
It is a really important part, but the interesting thing is, Richard, and I didn't ask you to reflect on that question, but maybe I should have. But I suspect that many people who might be watching this, if they just take 30 seconds to think about that question, they may come to the same conclusion. And I can either anecdotally draw a conclusion that we have very similar ambitions for leaders in my organization, or as other people may answer the same quickly in their head, that there's something there. And I think we know that in a lot of the trust model or the leadership models that are popular in today's environment, authentic leadership and so on, they're all built around trust as a key component. So that was one starting point, was asking our people to look back. The second thing we asked them to do was to think about, okay, here and now today, what do I need from my leader to be at my very, very best right now? But this time we made it a little more difficult. We gave them a list of 12 leadership behaviors. Now, these were inspired by our aforementioned, our shared beliefs, our values framework internally, but then also inspired a little bit by what's happening with the outside in thinking around leadership. And then we simply said, okay, 12 leadership behaviors. In order for you to be at your very best here and now today, what are the 3 most important for you? And it was a landslide, right? The gap between number 3 and number 4 across all these focus groups was actually quite wide. So again, strong consistency across regions, geographies, tenures, and functions in the company. And those 3 focused also around trust and development, and also challenging me to think in new ways. And then we asked probably the hardest question. So we looked back, we asked people to think about today, and then we asked them to look to the future. With all the growth ambitions we have in our strategy, look ahead 5 years. What do we need our leaders to stop, start, and continue doing? So The questions got progressively harder, but this also was a great data point because the stop, start, continue framework, as simple as it is, also gives you a sense of what are our leaders, not doing that need to start doing? What do our leaders need to stop doing that they're not doing well? But then also a great data point around continue is what do we need to make sure that we really can continue to have as part of our leadership culture that our people really appreciate. And again, big surprise, super consistent across the board.
Right. And so you've got those consistent answers all around trust, empowerment, challenging me to do more things, do new things. How do you then build that out into something tangible that you can work with?
Well, we then went through a couple of iterations, but it essentially we took our most senior executives, basically played all of this back to them in a workshop format, and then through about 3 or 4 iterations in sort of small workshops with that executive team, we then basically worked with them and anchored them very much in our aforementioned shared beliefs. So there's a strong connection between the shared beliefs or our values apply to everyone, regardless of where you sit in the organization. But when you become a leader, there are some additional expectations, and so they're very clearly linked. And so now we have a very clear list of expectations of leaders. And because we involve so many people in this kind of bottom-up process, it also creates this nice kind of, this is what you can expect, the messaging, this is what you can expect from me as a leader, when you're a team member, and vice versa. And when you want to become a leader, or if you become a leader, then these are the expectations the company and your team has of you.
Okay. And can you walk us through what those expectations are? I think I recall you talking about a kind of AC/DC model, if I remember.
Yes. So long story short, I mean, and I didn't say this at the beginning, Richard, about our business. So we're one of the world's premier producers of cable technology. So, for example, you see here in the background, I mean, you see all these nice wind farms around the world, all this green renewable energy. We actually produce the cable technology that connects the wind farms to the power grid. So that plays in a little bit with what I'll describe now. And if I go back nearly 4 years when our shared beliefs were developed, our shared beliefs are: we advance, we connect, we deliver, and we care. And someone close to the end, just before we launched these to the organization, realized something very interesting, that it just so happened that the acronym for those 4 was AC/DC. Which of course plays in really well with what it is, our purpose as a company, what we do. But then it also provides a nice acronym for not only remembering our shared beliefs, but then also, of course, it may happen that when we have leadership meetings and so on, that there might be some AC/DC music playing in the background. But so fast forward, and we actually realized that we didn't even want to introduce even new acronyms. I've seen many organizations go a bit overboard, kind of framework overload. So what we wanted to do was kind of reposition that when you become a leader in NKT, then there are additional expectations. And so we advance becomes advancing. We commit to advancing as a leader. We commit to connecting as a leader. Advancing is all about thinking about and preparing for the future. Connecting as a leader is all about collaboration, amplifying quieter voices, and so on. Delivering as a leader is all about making sure that we deliver on our promises, and that we balance both delegation and autonomy within the team. And then we commit to caring as a leader is, of course, all about our people. And that ranges all the way from making sure that we unlock the full potential in all of our team members, but also that we foster an environment of safety, both physical and psychological. And that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. You can see how you've taken those focus group responses and those key behaviors that you asked about from your leaders and translated those into something that people can really get their brains around.
Absolutely. And we, one thing to say, Richard, what we're really proud of the, the principles as a framework is that when you look at these, and if I'm a leader of a team of 5, or I lead a couple of teams of a total of 50, or I lead a function of 500, it still applies. It's just about the context changes a little bit, but it's really easy to apply them. And as well, they're really easy to work with in terms of developing people. And so this is, it sort of ticks all the boxes. And the fact that, as you say, that all of our colleagues, I actually just saw some colleagues this week who were in the focus group that I ran in Cologne. I was there this week, and a couple of people, came up and said hi, and were just super happy that, as we recently announced these, that they got to actually see their voice was heard.
Mhm. Oh, that's great. And so you say you've just announced these. So I guess you're in the process of rolling it out now. What are the next steps? How's it going so far?
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, we're going to do all kinds of things to really bring this to life. I will say that the big sort of milestone, and one thing I'm really proud about, is that this wasn't rolled out or announced by HR. It was actually announced by our CEO, and he insisted on that. So the 1st of March, we had a live global broadcast where I had the pleasure of actually interviewing our CEO. And for about 45 minutes in a live broadcast, it was then followed up by local conversations facilitated by our HR colleagues in all of our locations across the globe. But that 45-minute conversation started off with 15 to 20 minutes, actually not talking about these leadership principles, but actually our CEO diving in a little bit about his own career journey and the impacts of great, but also not so great leaders on his career. And then talking about how important leadership and leaders going forward are for our journey and our success as a company, and then introducing these principles and talking a little bit about what they mean for him. So great way to kick it off. I just had somebody yesterday tell me that they've watched the video now for the 2nd time. And and we will be using that. I can't stand to watch it because I don't like watching recordings of myself. But
sorry to pile on with this then.
No, but to have your CEO, it's a rare thing to have your most senior executives be so invested, genuinely invested in this type of initiative, and it's rarer than you think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can imagine there'll be heads of learning, heads of leadership watching this, banging the table, going, "How did you do it?" Because we hear so often about the importance of having leaders who are invested in learning, and you see how the businesses that have made learning and purpose a big part of who they are. The CEO is always a kind of cheerleader for that. And you think of the Microsofts and the Novartises and so on.
Yeah. And they're great. And there's some great examples out there. And it in many ways, it's very cliche, tone from the top. There's an expression I heard years ago that's always stuck in my head. We wash the stairs from the top, right? This kind of thing. Yeah. But I have found in my career, I'll go back to what I mentioned about our values framework. For us, our shared beliefs. This is only really the 2nd organization I've ever worked for where I can say hand on heart it means something. And I'm going to say again, this is only the 2nd organization I've ever worked for where I can say with conviction that our most senior executives, these types of initiatives around leadership, culture, and learning, they're all in. They're all in and invested with it. Now, I'd love to say to you, Richard, I really would, that our CEO did this because of my incredible persuasion and influencing skills. No, you know what? It's because he wanted to be part of it. And it is a great place to be. If you've ever been in an environment where you don't have to, all of our executives, when they make presentations internal and in most cases externally, they usually start by talking about our people, our culture. They mentioned specifically our shared beliefs, and now as well our leadership principles, without any arm twisting from HR. So rather than how did we get that to happen, I think it's more about how can we most take advantage of that. as people that work with what we do, and I'll certainly take advantage of it as long as I can.
Absolutely. And I mean, you talked about the background that you've got on there with the wind turbines and so on, but there's such a tangible purpose to what your organization does, and it's captured in that virtual background that you've got on. Do you think that has a lot to do with it when you already have such a sort of value-driven culture that these things come to
and I'll say this: there's people who've been in this company and in this industry a lot longer than me. I had a brief stint working with wind power in a previous company as well, and it is very compelling and very powerful to be associated with this. I think it's two things. I mean, there's something. We're a global company. We have a global footprint, but we're also there's a very strong Nordic Scandinavian part of our culture. I mean, our headquarters is in Copenhagen or Denmark. Our biggest employee base is in Sweden, and you see that kind of reflected in the company culture, the culture of humility. I would describe us, and this is me describing us, right? This isn't something from anything official, but I describe us as kind of the unsung hero of the green energy transition, because almost no one ever actually sees our products because they're either deep in the ocean or buried underground. But we play a big part in so much of what's happening in terms of the green energy transition, which is top of mind in terms of sustainability for everyone. So there's that part of it. But then also, I think this, going back to the kind of the Scandinavian roots of the company, you really get a sense of, again, going back to voices heard, and people want to have their voices heard. This is an organization that's incredibly non-hierarchical, even to the point I can tell you that by choice, our most senior executives who sit one floor up from where I sit, there's no closed door offices for anybody. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, the final question I was going to ask you was about how you make a change like this really stick. But I almost want to change my question slightly, because from what you're saying, it sounds like what you've really done is provide clarity and a framework around values that are already really deeply ingrained in how your company works.
Well, I'm building on, and again, I talked through at a high level what happened about 4 years ago, and one of my team members, she was heavily involved in that process, and I think getting your people involved, getting voices heard, and most of us already do that. Most organizations do that in some ways through things like engagement surveys and culture surveys, which you would find very few companies that didn't run this exercise at least once a year. The question is, what do you do? Right? Because it's all about building belief that when you ask your people what it is they think and what they really want and so on, that you actually do something with it. And I think this process that we've gone through with our kind of values framework and now our leadership principles, we really listened to our people, but then really done something with it. And there's so much power in that I think many companies have yet to unlock. That's one of the most powerful ways to make it stick.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Berry, thank you, and we're coming up to the end of the time that we had you down for. So I won't keep you much longer. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's really inspirational. Like, as we said throughout, there's so many of the things you've been able to put in place that a lot of the people who come to our events are really striving to achieve, about getting leadership buy-in for what they're doing, finding that really strong culture to build on. So I think a lot of people will take a lot of inspiration from what you've done and what you've achieved so far, and we look forward to seeing how it develops as you roll it out further. But thank you once more for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Absolutely, Richard. Thank you so much for asking me to join. I really appreciate it.